Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, are the Milwaukee Bucks contenders or pretenders in the Eastern Conference? We dig into the tiers of contending teams coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. You can find us on YouTube and get us wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Locked On Bucks today is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA to get $20 off your first purchase. Camille, we mentioned the contenders or pretenders for the Bucks, and the question that's being floated out there. They've been one of the more interesting teams this offseason because you either, and I think the former here is a smaller group, but you either buy into the, hey, they're healthy, they have a year of continuity, Doc Rivers has an offseason and a training camp with some of the younger guys and everybody in general. It can't be worse than it was a year ago. How can we not say a team with Giannis and Damian Lillard would not be contenders? Or they're older, 2 years in a row that they lost in the first round of the playoffs. I don't love the roster around them. How much longer can you rely on Chris Middleton and Brook Lopez? Yada, yada, yada. We've moved on. The Knicks and Sixers have had better off seasons. The Cavs kept the band together, etc. It's been very polarizing so far this season. The most exact science that you can get, I threw a poll question out there on Twitter X earlier today, just asking, what do you think? Are the Milwaukee Bucks contenders or pretenders this season? As of the last update, as we record this, been about 300 votes. 82% of the audience says the Bucks are contenders. So are those 82% correct?
I think that they're absolutely correct. I think that this Milwaukee Bucks team showed the bones of what they could be last year with just the pure talent on the court with Damian Lillard acquired, with Giannis, and with Chris when he was healthy. That piece of it with the Bucks is when they were healthy. Like that's the biggest, I would say, thing that gives me pause for the Bucks of this upcoming season is just health. And that's a byproduct of age and injury history that we've seen with this team because, yes, the Bucks have had 2 first-round exits in the playoffs. Injuries were a big part of that. I mean, Giannis got injured during that Heat series 2 years ago, and then last year he didn't even play against the Pacers in the playoffs. And without Giannis on the court, the Bucks' fortunes aren't that bright. So they have to have health. And we've talked about it before. I mean, since they won the championship, the Bucks have had unfortunate health luck once they get to the playoffs. And even during that finals run, we had to deal with Giannis injuring his knee, missing the Eastern Conference Finals, the last few games there, and then coming back for the finals. So to me, yes, I think that this team is a contender. I think that this roster makes a bit more sense on paper than it did last year. I think that another year of continuity, having an offseason where Dame knows where he's playing, ability to train, is going to go a long way. And I think Doc Rivers getting his feet settled and be able to install his system the way he wants it ran, and to be able to see everybody over the summer workout, be part of training camp, can also help with some of those younger players on the roster as well. So I definitely think the Bucks are in that contending tier. What about you?
I mean, I do, and maybe it's just blind faith, but for all the reasons that you said, that look, you can't discount the fact that when this team is healthy, and I know the full mix isn't there, but even last year, when you look at the best 5-man groupings in the league, the Bucks accounted for what, 3 of them, and right, like Malik Beasley was in those, but
Right.
he's gone. We've talked at length about the fact that the very least, Gary Trent Jr. should make it a wash, if not an upgrade over Malik Beasley. Still doesn't factor in or determine, is it going to be, hey, they got the best 5-man groupings or not. But I think for all those reasons, the fact that Giannis is still in his prime, and when they were healthy, we saw it worked last year. Was it consistent? No, but we saw it worked. The frustrating part about last year, and I've said this a number of times, we've talked about it on this show, was last year, I truly believe they were set up better than ever, at least the previous 2 seasons, to beat the Boston Celtics. The issue was they were vulnerable to a lot of other teams. So you had to get there to Boston, which did not happen. I don't think that changes this year. And I know it's easy to look at it and say, well, Boston has big wings. They have defense. They can switch. They have scoring coming from other places. How can you say the Bucks are on that level? Giannis, the Celtics don't have the Giannis stopper, quote unquote. And if
What do you mean, Al Horford? Justin?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if anything, that comes into question even more so, as we've pointed out, Kristaps Porzingis ain't playing until January. And I can promise you, one of these years, Al Horford is going to look like a player that's going on 40 and is no longer an all NBA caliber defensive player and the ideal big that you would want. So you have Giannis. You have the fact that Chris Middleton is the father of the Boston Celtics, as we've seen throughout his career. But the number one thing they always bogged down around was the half-court offense against the Celtics. And does Damian Lillard completely fix it? No, but he changes it. And that's what gave you the confidence. You look back, I know it's regular season games, but you look at those 3 games last year, that's what gave you confidence. So I'm still right there that I think they're contenders. But the caveat is, look, I don't want to speak in absolutes, but if for some reason the Bucks lose in the first round of the playoffs this season, then you're looking at this is probably over, and you can no longer have that conversation, at least with this exact group of personnel.
I agree with that. That's why I've been saying this is such an interesting season for the Bucks coming up, because it's one where nationally a lot of people don't have much faith in this team, or they're just kind of like, they're aging. I don't trust them. Dame's losing it. Giannis is losing athleticism, whatever the argument might be from certain national media pundits. And you have that, but you also have this whole idea of like, okay, if the Bucks do flame out again in the first round, I said it earlier this summer as well, like I think this team looks very different if that is the case to end the season. Like, I'm not sure if it's Doc Rivers. I'm not sure if it's which of the big 3, like something drastic.
You have an expiring contract in Brook Lopez. I would assume if you flame out, there's that's
probably done.
We're moving on. Chris Middleton has a player option. Pat Connaughton has a player option. Bobby Portis, I think, has a player option. He's in the final year too. So yeah, if that happens, there's a lot of changes that are going to be facing this team. We did put together our own tiers when we talk about contenders and pretenders in the Eastern Conference. We're going to get to that in the next segment. Before we get there, I just have one quick question for you as we talk about how polarizing the Bucks have been this offseason and all the other chatter. I guess it's a 2-part question. Number one, was it actually a good thing for the Knicks and the Sixers? And I guess you could lump in the Cavaliers to do what they did in this offseason to kind of allow the Bucks to say, we have time to figure this out. We can skate under the radar. All the attention is going to go, or a lot of the attention is going to go on those teams. So that's part one of the question. And I guess part 2 is, if those changes weren't made, are teams taking, or is the general landscape of NBA fans and media, are the Bucks taken more seriously this year?
It's a really good question. I do think that the fact that the Bucks were handicapped with what they were going to be able to do this offseason, just given the salary cap situation and what assets they had available going into it, like you knew it was going to be a pretty quiet offseason for the Bucks. We were, of course, thinking of possible trades they could do if they wanted to pull the trigger on trading a Brook Lopez or a Bobby Portis. Pat Connaughton's a name that was brought up as well, but then there's the whole argument of value around the league when it comes to that. You don't want to trade for pennies on the dollar with anything. So you have that aspect of it where, like, realistically, there wasn't too much that the Bucks could do. So it made sense to be like, this is going to be one of those off seasons where whatever they do, it's going to be bet men. So it's probably not going to be splashy or grab the headlines. Meanwhile, you have like a Philly team that had a boatload of cap space and they were able to land their big shark. And once that domino fell, everything else came with it. You see the Nova Knicks assembling with that big trade. And I think too, with the summertime, the summer's all about movement. And the Bucks just didn't have any moves bigger than Paul George going to Philly, than Mikal Bridges being traded to the Knicks. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for the Bucks, just given the fact that this past season, there was a lot of media attention on the team for a lot of reasons that they probably didn't want to be in the spotlight. So having a quiet offseason when you get to kind of put your head down and work, I think is good for the squad.
All right, tiers. We put together our own tiers. Spoiler, I think they're going to be very similar here, but the rationale behind those groupings, where the Bucks slot in as we take a look at the contenders in the Eastern Conference. Camille and I will get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you about our friends over at Game Time. You've heard Camille and I both talk about Game Time, how easy it is to use them as your number one ticketing service, especially when you're on the road, taking in new stadiums or arenas. All of the ease that the Game Time app offers for you. You can see the view from seats. Huge if you were just wrapping up your summer tour of baseball stadiums. Maybe you're about to start one for college football stadiums, basketball arenas, as well as it's that time of year. See the panoramic view from your seat within the app before you buy your ticket. You can also toggle on the feature to see the upfront price. No sticker shock once you get to the checkout. You can see the fees as you start to check out and complete your purchase. And best of all of this comes with the best ticket coverage there is in the market. Your purchase is covered with that most flexible customer service policy in the industry. Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you can find those seats cheaper elsewhere. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, to get $20 off your first purchase on Game Time. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. For your second listen, we invite you to check out the Locked On NBA podcast. As we know, there's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay, we said we put together our own tiers here to determine who are the contenders in the Eastern Conference. So let's just start with the number one tier. I know we're aligned on at least the first two or three tiers here. Yes. So we both have in the top tier of the East, the Boston Celtics. I don't think any explanation is needed as to why.
A tier of their own, I would honestly say, too, especially when you look at the offseason that they had, where they were pretty much able to bring everyone back who played a role in them becoming NBA champions this past season. Them not having Porzingis for the first half of the season or so is going to hurt, but they still have a lot of depth to be able to, during the regular season, just kind of maintain pace. And I mean, the team is just really well constructed. They have two-way guys all over the floor. It's well done. It's going to be tough to beat.
It's if you were building a basketball team right now and said, start from scratch, how would you want to assemble it? That's basically it. That is the blueprint in the Boston Celtics. Okay, on to tier number two. I'm going to list teams one by one. Then you just tell me yes or no if you also have them in your tier. So tier number two, the Philadelphia 76ers.
Yes.
The New York Knicks.
Yes.
And the Milwaukee Bucks.
Yes, and those are the only three that I would have in that next tier.
That is it for me as well in tier number two. And I think where it gets interesting is some of the discourse we've started to hear surrounding tiers on other shows and elsewhere this summer is tier number two. I have heard consisting of just two teams. I've heard of consisting of the 76ers, the Knicks, and maybe the Cavaliers or the Pacers. Mm-hmm. That I think a majority still hold the Bucks in this tier, but you've seen more and more of, I'm going to knock them down to tier.
You have. And again, I understand why, because you look at what the Pacers did. If you are somebody who looks at the Pacers and you don't see the 21 Hawks and you see a team that has something to continue to build on, I could see why you would elevate them into that particular tier. Me personally, I just can't put the Pacers up there with the rest of these guys, just given the road to the playoffs that they did have. They fought face a lot of teams with injuries, and not taking anything away from the Pacers because you can only play who's in front of you, and they did well with what they had in front of them. But something Philly, Milwaukee, New York just seem like they're just a slight tick above what the Pacers can bring to the table. And honestly, even Cleveland, another team that you hear thrown into that second tier every so often throughout this offseason. To me, Cleveland's a team that's bringing back a lot of the same guys, changing out their coaching staff to see if, that can be a starter for them going forward. They locked in their core. They have Donovan Mitchell locked up, Mobley locked up. They have Jared Allen locked up. So like they have their core, they have their window. I still need to see a little bit more from them though.
And shouts to John Corrales on Locked On Celtics, who had an interview with Joe Mazzulla. And one of the big takeaways from that was Joe Mazzulla saying Pacers was our toughest series. I know we swept them, but it should have went 7 games. That's how tough the series was contested. Tier number 3, same deal. I'll read off the teams. You tell me if you have them. The Cleveland Cavaliers.
Yep.
Indiana Pacers.
Yep.
And the Orlando Magic.
Yes.
And that is it for tier number 3. Okay, so we're aligned there. That's the interesting group. And this, by no means, I think I should clarify too. I'm not saying this is how I think they will finish in the standings. This is more of contention tiers. You could talk me into it. I know I said on one of the last shows we did with Frank, I think the 76ers are going to finish with the most wins in the East. I wouldn't be shocked if Cleveland finished 2nd or 3rd in Eastern Conference standings too, because they kept that group together. I think they got a very, very good coach in Kenny Atkinson. And if somebody's going to make it work, when we said there's a lot of redundancy with their personnel, it would be Kenny Atkinson. So they're an interesting team. It's tough to discount the Pacers, given, as you mentioned, you can only play who's in front of you. They made the conference finals a year ago. But the other part that you mentioned, especially as someone is we both covering a team that played that Atlanta Hawks team. Not strong, but you get some Atlanta Hawks vibes from what the Pacers did. And the Orlando Magic seem like they're everyone's look out for this team this upcoming season.
Yeah, and I feel like Orlando was a little bit of that last year, where it was like, hey, they might do something. They might push for a play-in. They should be competitive. And Orlando came out and really impressed me, honestly, with just how consistent they were able to be throughout the season. And their biggest Achilles heel last year was just that 3-point shooting. They couldn't shoot. The defense was there. They have a team full of a lot of tall, lengthy guys where it's like the defense.
John Hammond staple.
Yeah. Exactly. And I love that they got KCP this offseason, someone who's a consistent 3-point shooter. He's had 5 straight seasons where he shot at least 39% from 3. So like he's somebody who, if he continues to play the way that he can or has in the past, like that's going to be a great addition for them. And if some of the other guys on that roster can find that 3-point stroke, Orlando could be something really, really interesting this upcoming season.
And just an overall glue guy too, that you can plug and play anywhere. And I think that's the one. Criticism's too harsh, but the one thing you would point out is I don't really buy the offense for the Magic, that if they would have gotten that piece, then it's a really interesting conversation. But on the flip side, I think it's also good that you bring in, and I don't mean this as a knock on him, but you bring in somebody like KCP where it's not going to be expected you carry the offense. And there's that pressure on him. Just do what you did in Denver, do what you did with the Lakers. You can give us more perimeter defense and give us some 3-point shooting. Let's pause on the mid-tier teams, because I think the easiest one to knock out is the last tier. Yes. I have 3 teams in my final tier. Do you as well?
My final tier, my tier 5, I have 5 teams grouped in there.
Oh, okay. So I have the Pistons.
Okay. I got them.
The Wizards.
Yep.
And the Brooklyn Nets as my bottom 3 teams.
And I have the other 2 bottom of this particular tier. Okay. But in addition to those 2 teams, I also have the Charlotte Hornets and the Toronto Raptors. And the Raptors is one of those teams that could jump into that play-in tier right above this one. But at the moment, like I don't really see it for Toronto. They didn't have a great offseason this year, but you can argue that they made all their moves during last season when they made the big trade with the Knicks. So the Raptors, it's a team where I'm like, I don't know. But if Scotty Barnes turns into continues reaching that potential, like that could change the tier for the Raptors for me.
I have 2 additional tiers. It sounds like you just have 1. So we'll get into that conversation and then circle back to tier number 2 and some of the thoughts on those teams that are in it, including the Bucks. We will get into that conversation coming up next here on Locked On Bucks. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right. So the interesting part of this is you had 5 tiers. I have 6. Mm-hmm. So your other tier, the what would we even call it? The play-in tournament tier?
Yeah, it's like my play-in tier.
So you have the Heat, Hawks, and Bulls.
Yes.
I have so we had Cavs, Pacers, Magic in that 3rd tier.
Mm-hmm.
Right now I have the Heat in the 4th tier as the only team in there.
By themselves.
And then after that, 4-team tier of the Hawks, Hornets, Bulls, and Raptors. The Heat are in there, but this is kind of okay, look, we can say this because we're a team that also has to, quote unquote, prove it, but prove it. We got to see something because we've heard about Heat culture. We've heard about watch out for the Heat. Mm-hmm. And you've been a play-in tournament team for the last couple of years. So got to see something this year. Otherwise, you're going to be anchored down with teams like the Hawks and the Bulls. I don't really quickly here. I don't see any scenario where the Hawks, the Hornets, the Bulls, the Raptors are anywhere but the 7 through 10 range or lower in a play-in tournament team. I don't see them being one of the playoff teams. I guess you could talk me into it with the Heat, but it's going to take quite a bit of litigation.
And I think something would have, the way I'm looking at it, for Miami to jump out of that play-in tier, because we both kind of agree that they're in that 4th tier, like something would have to go wrong with one of the other team. Yeah, for Miami to jump that tier for me. And Miami's a team that I was like, I just have trouble placing them. Play-in felt fair because looking at all the other teams around them, I just couldn't put them above Boston, Philly, Milwaukee, New York, Indy, Cleveland, Orlando. But then it's like, they should be better than Chicago. They should be better than Atlanta. But it's like, I kind of feel like those teams are kind of together. Toronto, like I mentioned, could go either way. They might get off to a slow start. I do wonder if it's a season where it's like, well, we're gonna what's the phrase now? Stag our flag. What's the phrase for Cooper flag? Like,
plant our flag for Cooper here.
Yeah, they could be a team that falls into that category. And I think the Hornets are going to be fun this year with Charles Lee there. I think he's going to establish a culture, but I don't see them taking a big jump this upcoming season. But my question to you is, with your 6 tiers, Washington, Detroit, Brooklyn, for sure. Like those are, I get it. But what was like some of the logic behind splitting up that Miami, Chicago, Atlanta, Toronto, Charlotte piece of it?
So it's kind of funny because I guess now that we're in football season too, the Heat are kind of like the Pittsburgh Steelers, where it seems like year in, year out, regardless of what happens, you're almost ready to move on, even if the personnel, like, they're going Russell Wilson or Justin Fields this year. And the last few years, some of the quarterbacks that were trotted out there in Pittsburgh and talking yourself into, well, it's over. It's time to move on. And they're not this. And then they just hang around where you start to build up this sense of, I guess I have to put the Steelers in there to go 10-7 or 9-8, something like that, just because they always do it. That's where I'm kind of at with the Heat of, I guess they're going to be like 7 or 8, and the most quote unquote terrifying of those play-in tournament teams that if, and maybe this is just, me doing what I have preached others to not do. And hey, dig into the numbers. Don't just look at the front of the jersey, but it's probably as simple as if the Bucks were the 2 seed and they're getting one of the play-in tournament teams of that group of teams you just mentioned, the Heat are probably the team that I would least want to face.
I mean, part of it is just the history of that particular team in this Jimmy Butler era, where it's like whether they're a top seed or a low seed, you can't count them out because Jimmy Butler is one of those players that once it turns to playoff time, he completely ups his level of play. And this is going to be a season really interesting to me for Miami with Jimmy Butler looking for that new contract as well. Do we see more effort from Jimmy throughout the regular season and not just in the playoffs? Like, what does that look like for Miami? And if he is playing that way in a regular season, how much does that boost what they have going on? But again, too, Miami has had some bad injury luck throughout the regular season. So if they stay healthy, what does that ceiling look like for them? There's just some questions around Miami for sure, where I could see, to your point of, you don't want to see them in the playoffs if they're a lower seed, but I do wonder if we're coming to the end of that magical Miami Heat journey where it's like you can't count them out. Like, are we giving them too much a benefit of a doubt at this point? But as a Bucks fan and seeing them so frequently, I can't help but give them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, and to that point, too, just as we mentioned with Al Horford, you kind of mentioned it there. How much longer does this last with Jimmy Butler, with Kevin Love, with those type of guys, with Scary Terry? Is Terry Rozier going to be healthy and give them everything that they thought he would? Some of the younger guys that they've added have certainly shown you something and look like they're good players. And Jaime Jaquez, Haywood Highsmith, who we heard early in the offseason, the Bucks were kicking the tires on, and we're interested in Nikola Jovic too. But barring something unforeseen here, I think the issue that they run into is those are nice role players and they have maybe a little bit higher of a ceiling, but I don't, famous last words, I don't see Nikola Jovic or Tyler Hero or any of that group that I just mentioned being the second best player on a title contending team. So that's kind of what they're missing. Bam Adebayo is good, but, and again, I don't mean this to be disrespectful or as a knock. You get like Anthony Davis vibes that he checks a lot of boxes. Are you a contender if he's your best player, right? Like, it worked when you went to Los Angeles and you had LeBron James next to you. Jimmy Butler did that in the playoffs a couple of times, and that's when it really worked. But that's where I'm kind of at with the makeup of that Miami Heat team.
No, and I think that's really fair. So a question to you as we wrap up here, just talking about the dregs of the East here with that Washington, Detroit, Brooklyn tier. Of those 3 teams that we both think will be the worst of the East, if you had to bet any money, if you had to go on to FanDuel and place a bet on which of those teams would finish last in the East, which of those teams would you go for? Washington, Detroit, or Brooklyn?
Brooklyn in a heartbeat, because they have already made it known we have no intention of winning next
Completely.
year. And and the fact too, I know Washington made some moves, and you look at the players. I mean, you can count it on one hand that you would look at with the Wizards and say, hey, a nice play. Denny Avdia is gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you just go up and down the list of, who's this roster? Patrick Baldwin Jr., Johnny Davis, Malcolm Brogdon is there. I would assume Malcolm Brogdon, Sadiq Bey. Yeah, I would assume Malcolm Brogdon gets traded at some point. The Nets have already made it clear. This is what we're doing. We are trying to trade away these players. Bub Carrington's going to play. He's going to be okay. For a rookie, he's going to score. You still have Kyle Kuzma. I would imagine you look to trade him this year if you're the Wizards, and that would bring down or boost up your tank ability there. But they have some young guys that they're going to play. Jonas Valanciunas, another guy that's probably traded. Same story for the Brooklyn Nets, and I think they have pieces that make more sense to trade that are going to fetch them something. When you look at Dorian Finney-Smith, Bojan Bogdanovic is out there and available at the midpoint in the season to be traded. Nick Claxton signed in the offseason.
Yeah.
That's another guy. He doesn't match with the timeline. So maybe it's not this year. Maybe it's next year. But the big one, too, in addition to Dorian Finney-Smith, is Cam Johnson. Because he's extension eligible and what happens there, I would assume he's traded. I think the Nets have more tradable pieces, and they're just going to continue to shed some of those guys. So it may be a race for who finishes with the worst record in the league and in the Eastern Conference, but I think the Nets are going to edge out the Wizards there.
Yeah, I could definitely see that as well. I do want to just say, as we wrap up to Detroit, I think they'll be better than last year. Not better enough to escape the bottom tier, but better than what we saw. There should be more wing stop in Detroit this year than was last year. And I mean, honestly, the Detroit offseason, they did some things that just they make sense around that roster and trying to put some spacing and vets around.
A lot of it makes sense.
But execution, I'm not buying.
A lot of it makes sense. There is no world where, and here's the free piece of advice I'll offer. Be careful on criticizing individual players, especially when you work on broadcasts for a team, because you never know when that player is going to end up on your team.
That's fair. That's fair.
That being said, what was the market for Tobias Harris, and what was the point of that signing?
Maybe to have an adult in the room. Honestly, I think that was just to get an adult in the room. Another vet.
Do you think, and this more speaks to just, wow, were the Pistons bad last year? They could win 10 more games or more than they did a season ago. And an increase of 10 plus games is nothing to scoff at, but that we're still talking 24, 25.
Exactly. Not crossing that 30-game mark yet. Even if they have a 10-game improvement, which is I see Detroit improving from last year, just not improving enough to.
What's the max you could see for wins from the Pistons this year?
No more than, I would put their over under at 28.5. Yeah, somewhere in that range.
You mentioned them earlier as we start to wrap here. What about the Hornets?
I love Charles Lee, and I think that he is going to be a good culture setter for the Hornets. The Hornets have had also bad injury luck with LaMelo Ball. That's the star of that team, and he hasn't been fully healthy. So again, if they can get a season with LaMelo healthy, I do like that for them. I like Brandon Miller, what we saw out of him last season as well. And I think they can make some noise. I think that they can be good for sure. They got to be healthy, and they have to really build what their culture is going to be. But again, better than what they were last year, but not a playing team. Maybe they're in that play-in race, around All-Star break, and it's looking that way. But I don't see them finishing above a 10 seed.
They have more rotational players.
Yes.
And that's the last thing that you mentioned. That's the thing for me. I think I said on a previous show too. Of that group, of the tiers that we went through in the lower tiers, you could talk me into the Hornets finishing 10th and getting the final play-in spot. If Brandon Miller continues to grow, if LaMelo Ball is healthy, Mark Williams too. It always takes a couple of years. Yeah, if he's healthy, and it takes a couple years for young bigs to really start to ascend. So they've added those. Josh Green's a rotational player. Seth Curry's there. You talk about adults in the room. Taj Gibson is on the roster. So they've upgraded in that sense that I would not be shocked if the Hornets were fighting for 10th and the play-in tournament. Yeah. We spent a lot of time talking about the teams that are not going to be contending. So as we wrap up here, 3 teams in the second tier, the Sixers, the Knicks, and the Bucks. If one of those were to exit, who is most likely? And who's the team below them that would bump them out?
It's an interesting question. I foresee the 76ers being a good regular season team. Yeah. Of course, they have to also count on Embiid being healthy for 65-ish games. I like that arbitrary number right there at the NBA set. But if they do that, I can see Philly winning a lot of regular season games. Yeah. Milwaukee is healthy. Can see that for them as well. New York is the one for me. That's the team in that particular tier that I have some question marks around. I've mentioned it on the crossover episode that we did with Locked On Knicks yesterday, where I was like, I think that loss of Isaiah Hartenstein is going to loom large for the Knicks, because he was a big that fit really well in what they do. And I do have questions around the Julius Randle fit with this team going forward and what they do with that. And I could see a situation if he's not getting his touch, like how does that affect chemistry if he's not the focal point that he was used to being on this team prior? And if they fell out, honestly, I could honestly see the Pacers or the Cavaliers being that team to take a jump. And if I had to pick one, I'm gonna go with the Pacers that would jump into that top tier over the Knicks.
We were almost 100% aligned, top to bottom on this. I would also say the Knicks. And again, maybe we're being homers. Maybe it's blind optimism. If for no other reason than, look, I know it can, but I'm just going to say it can't go any worse than it did last year for the Bucks, that they experienced their year from hell.
Mm-hmm.
I have questions about the Knicks. What you brought up with the loss of Isaiah Hartenstein, the Julius Randle piece, they seemed to play a lot better with him off the floor last year once they shifted to Hartenstein as their big. And oh, by the way, he's had some very cryptic comments out there on social media as well, as he's somebody that's looking to get paid. Plus, we've seen this flame out in every previous stop from Tom Thibodeau, that it ages like milk.
Yeah.
And we saw Jalen Brunson not hold up, and we're not, it's not like you're living in a glass house throwing stones. We had somebody that went down too. We had players that went down each of the last 2 years in the playoffs. So that's my big concern is, look, he didn't hold up last year in the playoffs. You need him to get through 4 rounds. He's already a smaller guard, and you're putting a lot of wear and tear, not just on Jalen Brunson, on Dante, on everyone. We joked about Tibbs salivating over the fact that he finally has a player on his roster that's played 83 games in a regular season. But I don't know that that's a good thing. And that's my question there is, smoke and mirrors is a bit harsh, but can you stay at that level? Because everybody was quick to point to the Knicks are doing what the Celtics did. Again, famous last words, and be careful, but yeah, it's Kmart version of what the Celtics did. The Celtics have two-way players. The Knicks have guys that can defend and guys that are good enough, but they're not at that level offensively as the Celtics. So that is my major question with those tiers. And the team that I would say that would jump in there would be the Cavs, just because that's the regard that I hold Kenny Atkinson in with his coaching ability. And as we joked, it didn't work, but if anybody can find a way to make it work, and they kept that group together, it's Kenny Atkinson, the way that he diagrams some offense. And we've seen him work with these guys before in the past, too, when you think about LeVert, Jared Allen, and some of those guys that he had in Brooklyn. So that's the team that I'm very curious to see. We kind of joked before of the Bucks run of, 6 years? 6 years, right? 6 years of division titles come to an end. I think the Cavs would be the team to end it, not the Pacers. So that's the interesting part about all these tiers. We're going to have a lot more discussion about tiers related discourse and conversation as we start to get into more and more season previews. Next week, we're going to be back to 5 days a week by the time we hit next Monday, Camille, we're going to be 2 weeks away from Media Day for the Milwaukee
already.
Bucks.
That summer is really over, y'all. Like we are in the fall. The shows are starting. Football is back, and Media Day is around the corner.
Leave your comments. We will get to those on YouTube. And your thoughts on our tiers here. What did we miss? Do you disagree with anything? Who is that team that's most likely to fall out of the top, and who would replace them, or anything that we talked about and you feel we screwed up on this show? Leave those comments. We'll get to those and address them in the comment section and on the rest of the shows that we have this week as well. Thanks again for making Locked On Bucks your first listen today. Now go check out Locked On NBA, where the season never ends. So you get national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NBA in the description of today's show, so you don't even have to search for it. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That will do it for today's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.